Hello, everyone. It's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another top 5 cards from Aether Revolt. So that means Chaz is here once again. How's it going today, Chaz?
I'm doing well. We get to talk about your favorite color today, so I'm always excited because you're excited.
Oh, that's true. We get to talk about the 5 best blue cards, and blue, of course, being the best color in all Magic. Everyone knows that,
Ah,
except Chaz. Chaz hasn't come around to that yet. So let's jump right into it with, oh man, I love this card so much. This is one of my favorite cards from the entire set. Mechanized production. Anything that says you win the game is alright in my book, and this is actually a pretty sweet way of winning the game. So, Chaz, is this a real standard playable, or am I just hyped because it's an against the odds card?
well, if we're gonna figure out if it's standard playable, it's gonna be because of you, right, Seth? So you're gonna have to show the world how great mechanized production is, because I'm assuming we're going to see against the odds very, very soon. But the good thing is actually doesn't even really need to be a win condition, right? Like you don't really need to make the win the game with it, because you could just keep making copies of already legitimately good card, right? Like if you name, we're going to talk about this in the future, but metallic mimic, and just keep making metallic mimics every turn. That's actually still pretty good, right? The good thing is we still have clue tokens in the format, and that feels like the easiest way because you can't really interact with clue tokens as well. And once this kind of gets going, it's kind of hard to stop.
Yeah, I just want to put this on a Panharmonicon. I don't care about winning the game. I just want to see
Oh
how many
wow.
Panharmonicons I can get because that sounds pretty sweet. Really, though, I've played decks with clue tokens. I've seen competitive decks playing Tireless Tracker and other clue token generators that make so many clue tokens they almost don't know what to do. It doesn't seem outside the realm of possibility that you could make 8 clue tokens pretty easily and just use this to win the game. So I almost think this could be a legitimate win condition. I mean, if the goal is get 8 clue tokens on the battlefield, cast this, and wait a turn to win the game, I could see a real deck being able to do that in a pretty timely manner in standard. I mean, it might just be the against the odds player in me, but I could really see that working. And you're right, even without winning the game, just sitting out on an artifact and copying it every turn is pretty sweet. There's some really cool artifacts that are worth copying in Kaladesh. You mentioned a good one in the Mimic, but really, I mentioned Panharmonicon, and there's just a ton of options. Even putting this on a Bombat Courier and making one every turn isn't that bad. That's a lot of free value that you're getting over the course of a few turns, and Bombat Courier has to be about as bad as it gets for targets. So this, it's just hard to deal with, especially if you can put it on an important non-creature artifact. Put it on a Prophetic Prism. Who's going to kill it? And you're just got your own personal Howling Mine drawing you an extra card every turn. So I wouldn't be surprised to see people experimenting with this card, even if they're not really planning on winning the game with it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a good card in and of itself. So it's almost like just the gimmick in it is an afterthought. And once you hit the 8 artifacts, because like you said, I mean, these clue decks can just produce clue tokens so fast. So anything that gets an extra little bit of mileage out of good old Thraben Inspector, at least for a little while longer, is awesome in my book.
Let's move on to the blue rares. First up, we have Baral, cheap of compliance, so kind of a new counterspell lord, sort of. So, Chaz, what do you think about this one? This one is legendary. Does that mean it's just a commander plant, or could this see play in standard as well?
I have to tell you, Seth, if it's any card that is going to entice me to play blue in standard, it is this card. And I'm assuming it's going to be really good to build around a commander, but I do not think it's just a commander plant. The fact that it's legendary is almost irrelevant because you can cycle away additional copies of Baral if you don't need them by countering spells. I think this has a strong chance, a very strong chance, at seeing competitive standard play because, like you said, we've talked about this on the podcast all the time. It just kind of feels like blue can never catch up, and the counter spells just aren't matching one for one well enough. Well, that is really smoothed out a lot by Baral going forward. And not just even counter spells, but you get 1 mana Harness Lightnings, you get 1 mana You get 1 mana Immolating Glare. I think that's the one that I think it's called. But, I mean, you get 1 mana Anticipates. So dropping everything down a mana is really relevant, especially early on in the game. And it's a 1/3, so it can block pretty profitably from the early, a couple of the early drops in the format. Even Sylvan Advocate doesn't even punch through this.
Yeah, and that's not even to mention that the cost reduction fact is actually pretty playable. We see Goblin Electromancer, which essentially has the same text on it. Being a modern staple in Storm, Storm isn't near the top of the format right now, but it is a 4 of in a real modern deck. So we know that 2 drops that make instant sorceries cost 1 less are playable, and this has a lot of upside with its second ability. It has more toughness, which is great, and it's mono blue, so you don't necessarily have to be playing red in your deck. So I think there's a lot of potential here as well. And we've also seen Jace's Sanctum just recently in the mono blue Prism decks in Standard being played for this exact same purpose. So I think there's a lot of potential with Baral. Exactly where it fits, I'm still not sure. It's possible that it could be good enough in just a control list if you're playing a blue-red or blue-black or Esper control list in Standard, that you just want to play this as a good blocker that makes your stuff cheaper. A Glimmer for 3 mana instead of 4, and Harness Lightning for 1 mana instead of 2. Those are pretty big tempo swings, and it doesn't take too many spells of cheating on Nana and maybe a loot or 2 at some point to make it worth its 2 mana investment. Moving on to our next blue rare, Baral's Expertise. So we've talked about the red one, we've talked about the black one. Where does Baral's Expertise fit in the hierarchy of expertise cards, Chaz?
It's certainly, it doesn't feel as flashy as the others, but I think it's going to gain in popularity as we go along, especially because it plays so well with Baral. And I love how each of these expertise plays so well with the legend that they're named after. This being played for 4 mana as opposed to 5 mana actually is a huge deal, and this is an immense tempo swing, especially if you're able to drop a Gideon after you play Baral's Expertise. That just seems amazing to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And when I first saw this card, I was kind of down on it and thought it was one of the worst of the expertises, but I didn't actually consider that you can bounce one of your own creatures and use the second part of Baral's Expertise to put it back into play. So you can potentially like bounce 2 of your opponent's things and pick up your own Reflector Mage, for example, and just immediately replay your Reflector Mage for free, which is kind of weird how the timing of all that works, but that does work. So I think that it actually might have some potential. 5 mana feels like a lot, but I'm sure there's some cool tricks you can do, and it could also be a part of Aetherflux Reservoir, like combo decks where you want to pick up a bunch of your own artifacts and replay them for value to generate more Aetherflux Reservoir storm count, or even just to draw more cards in a Metalwork Colossus deck with your Prophetic Prisms and Metal Spinners, Puzzle Knots, and that stuff. So I think there's some untapped potential there. It's not the most obviously powerful of the cycle of expertises, but I think after people start playing with it, it might move up the rankings and actually be one of the more playable ones.
Yep, I agree with you.
Next we have something that Baral can make cheaper and even get a loot trigger from. Disallow, our Aether Revolt version of Cancel with some upside. So Chaz, what do you think about our Stifle Cancel hybrid?
Yeah, it's the mono blue Void Slime. So we haven't seen an effect like this in quite some time, especially in Standard. I think, again, just pointing out that it does play really well with Baral. It takes care of Emrakul triggers, so while you still have to deal with the Emrakul, at least you don't have to deal with being mind-slavered. So I do think this has a place in Standard, and I don't know how well it's going to rank between all of the counter spells, but I think you're going to at least want to play a couple of these if you're going for that heavy control draw go list where you just kind of get rid of something clean or get rid of a trigger that you don't need. You can stop a Aetherworks Marvel trigger or just counter the Aetherworks Marvel itself. So it has a lot of different applications.
Yeah, I think it's gotten better with the advent of the new style of Aetherworks Marvel decks, that instead of really putting all their eggs in winning with the first Aetherworks Marvel activation are more happy to play only a few finishers and plan on playing a real game of Magic and activating Marvel 2 or 3 or 4 times. When it only took one Aetherworks Marvel activation to win the game, then this card isn't as good. But when your opponent's planning on activating again and again, being able to stifle essentially the trigger from the battlefield and draining your opponent from 6 energy is actually a really huge swing. Not only does it stop that activation, but it stops your opponent from hitting a puzzle knot off the Aetherworks Marvel to spin the wheel again the next turn. So I think it got better with how some of these decks are, and it's probably going to be a pretty important card to the format. And plus, it's standard, and in standard, 3 mana counters are kind of the baseline. So you're kind of just getting all upside. If we were still in a world where counterspell was a standard card or even mana leak, then I wouldn't be as excited. But when you got to pay 3 mana for your counter anyway, having a stifle stapled to it is just pure value and pure upside.
Totally agreed. It's going to get a lot. Again, it just has some great applications, and I think you're going to want to at least play a few of them, whether it be in the sideboard or your main deck if you're playing.
Our last blue card on our list, Whir of Invention, essentially the artifact version of Court of Calling. So, Chaz, what do you think about this one? What are you planning on searching out of your library with Whir of Invention?
Well, this is another great way to get those Aetherworks Marvel into play, right? So, I think it's a pretty good card. I mean, like you said, Aether Revolt and Kaladesh gave us a plethora of interesting ways to have all these weird combos. I mean, you can get a lot of stuff from Aetherworks Marvel to Paradox Engine to all these different cards that we're going to talk about later on in the series. But this is a great way to utilize all these little artifacts that you're going to be playing, and again, Court of Calling into your, I think, obviously that's the best comparison, into your combo pieces, just like you would for the collected company list, that you kind of use your creatures and then go get the last piece of a combo and you're good, or just get that value creature that you need right at that moment.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I really like this card. Is I expect there will be a lot of decks in Aether Revolt Standard that are built around a specific combo, and a lot of them are artifacts, like you mentioned, Paradox Engine, Panharmonicon, Aetherflux Reservoir, Aetherworks Marvel, and one of the problems with playing those decks, and I've played almost all those decks, and against odds or somewhere, the problem with a lot of those decks is they're insane when they have their namesake card. Aetherflux Reservoir is super powerful, but when you don't have your namesake card, you just do nothing. So having essentially 8 copies of your Aetherflux Reservoir or your Panharmonicon or your Aetherworks Marvel is a really big deal and adds a lot more consistency. Plus, it's an instant speed, which allows for some pretty neat tricks. In the worst case, you can grab a Filigree Familiar as a chump blocker to keep yourself alive from a lethal attack and maybe buy yourself one more turn to combo off. So I think this card will end up seeing a lot of play. I even think there's some chance that it sees play in certain decks in Modern if Tesserator ever becomes a thing. Also, if Eggsless make a comeback with Carrot Clan Ironworks, it's kind of an additional reshape effect that doesn't require you to sack an artifact. So I think there could be some Modern potential as well, because tutoring stuff out of your library, especially on the cheap when you can tap stuff to pay for it, is just a really powerful effect. We see it with Court of Calling. Tutors are powerful, cheating on mana is powerful. You put both of those things together, you have a doubly powerful card in a lot of ways. Anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our top 5 blue cards from Aether Revolt, Chaz. So why don't you pick out your favorite from the list? I know blue's not your color, but do any of these stick out above the rest?
Yeah, again, I'm going to have to stick with Baral. Like I said, it's really enticing me to play some blue-based decks in Standard, at least, because we always look for these tools. We talk about it on the podcast that, sometimes it feels like control is just left out in the cold, and this could just be a little small piece to bringing that back and hopefully at least shaking up Standard enough to combat some of the stuff that's going on.
Well, you probably know where I'm going with this one, but I gotta go with Mechanized Production.
Have to.
That's just the most me card, maybe in the whole set. Copying stuff, against the odds potential, winning the game on your upkeep. It's all the janky, fun stuff that I love in a Magic card. So I actually like a lot of the blue cards, but that one clearly sticks out above the rest for me, so. Anyway, everyone, that's been our top 5 blue cards from Aether Revolt. So Chaz and I will be back tomorrow to talk about another color. Until then, thank you very much for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. We'll see you next time.